The deathbed of a tyrant, King Henry VIII, once the most feared monarch in Europe, now lay rotting upon his bed in Whitehall. His swollen body was barely human, riddled with ulcers that burst and poured foulness into the sheets. The stench of death filled the palace, a warning that the Lion of England was nothing more than decaying flesh. A palace in fear, courtiers crept like shadows, whispering that divine punishment had fallen upon their king. No servant spoke above a breath, for in Henry's final days, even a glance, even a word, could still mean death. Terror clung to the palace as tightly as the stench of his wounds. Haunted by the dead, at night screams tore through the king's chambers. Witnesses swore he saw the faces of his executed wives, pale and unblinking in the dark. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, women he had destroyed returned as phantoms to claim vengeance from beyond the grave. The failure of faith. Priests knelt at his side, muttering prayers, drowning the air with incense. Yet heaven remained silent. No miracle touched him. It was as though paradise had rejected him, leaving only the black mouth of damnation open, wide. Visions of judgment, burning with fever. Henry muttered of chains, flames, and shadowed figures. Some claimed he saw the victims of his cruelty, slaves, soldiers, innocents, waiting to drag him into eternal torment. The final terror. Once a king who ruled through fear, Henry VIII ended as a man consumed by it. The terror he unleashed upon others had finally come to devour him. And so the question remains. Was it sickness that claimed England's most brutal king, or the demons of his own sins? He was not always the monster that history remembers. When Henry Tudor first rose to the throne, he shone like a golden prince, admired by his people and celebrated across Europe. Broad-shouldered, athletic and radiant in appearance, he embodied everything a Renaissance monarch was meant to be. To his subjects, he was not just a king, but a promise of a brighter future. London rejoiced at his coronation. Banners rippled in the wind, bells rang across the city, and the people believed a glorious age had dawned. Yet beneath the splendor of those first years, shadows stirred. From the very beginning, Henry's heart burned with obsessions that would one day consume him. He longed for greatness, not only as a ruler but as a figure who would live forever in the pages of history. To him, glory was fragile unless it was carved in blood, and legacy was meaningless unless it was secured by sons. The Tudor dynasty, only a generation old, rested precariously on his shoulders. He knew it could vanish with him if he left no male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon was meant to secure peace between England and Spain, but when she failed to give him a surviving son, frustration began to rot inside him. Every miscarriage, every stillborn child, became not only a private grief but a public humiliation. To Henry, it was proof that God was testing him, or worse, cursing him. His dynasty, his power, his very identity as a chosen king depended on an heir, and without one, his reign would always be fragile. As years passed, his charm began to crack. The prince who once dazzled with laughter and music revealed flashes of rage that terrified those around him. Ambassadors noted his sudden storms of anger, his suspicion of friends, and his inability to forgive even the smallest slight. Those who once walked proudly at his side began to tread carefully, afraid that a careless word or gesture could seal their doom. Henry's hunger for power stretched far beyond his court. He dreamt of conquests to rival the heroes of old. Campaigns in France were launched in pursuit of eternal glory, yet the victories were fleeting and the cost was staggering. Fields were left soaked in blood. Families in England mourned their sons, and peasants groaned under the weight of taxes meant to fund his ambitions. For the king, their suffering was insignificant. What mattered was his name, his triumph, his image etched forever in history. The mask of majesty still charmed the crowds who saw him in glittering processions dressed in gold, but inside the walls of his court, fear had already taken root. The Tower of London grew crowded with prisoners, accused of treason, many on charges fabricated to satisfy Henry's paranoia. Rivals, ministers, even former allies found themselves dragged before executioners for crimes they had not committed. The king, who had once ruled with charisma, now ruled with suspicion and blood. Whispers spread of foreigners, watched with suspicion, of religious minorities suppressed, of voices silenced in the name of unity. Henry's obsession with absolute control left little room for diversity or dissent. What began as charm and magnificence was hardening into tyranny. The Golden Prince had begun his slow descent into darkness, and though the people still celebrated his power, the seeds of terror had already been planted. The story of Henry's rise was no tale of glory. It was the prelude to horror. For every triumph, he claimed, left behind scars of fear, and every act of power was purchased with the suffering of those who stood in his shadow. The young king, who had been hailed as England's hope, was becoming something far more dangerous, and the kingdom did not yet realize that the hands which lifted in blessing would soon drip with blood. The glory that had once surrounded Henry VIII slowly began to fade, replaced by a shadow that stretched across every corner of his kingdom. The years of triumph hardened into years of suspicion and cruelty. His desire for a son, an heir to carry the Tudor name, drove him into decisions that scarred England forever. Catherine of Aragon had given him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving son, and Henry's frustration burned into obsession. He convinced himself that his marriage was cursed, that God had closed Catherine's womb because their union was sinful. This obsession led him to a choice that shook the foundations of Europe. He cast aside Catherine, defying both the Pope and the Catholic Church, to take Anne Boleyn as his wife. In doing so, he shattered England's centuries-old bond with Rome, tearing his country away from the spiritual authority that had bound it to Christendom. The act was not merely political, it was revolutionary, and it carried the stain of blood. Those who resisted his new order, priests and nobles alike, were branded traitors. Heads fell on the block, monasteries were stripped bare, treasures looted, and centuries of tradition reduced to rubble. But Anne Boleyn's star burned short and fierce. She too failed to give him a son, and Henry's love turned to suspicion. Whispers of infidelity and betrayal swirled through the court, whispers Henry was all too eager to believe. Anne was accused, tried and condemned, though her guilt was doubtful at best. She died on the scaffold, her head severed in a single stroke, and Henry walked away unmoved, already seeking another bride to satisfy his hunger for an heir. The pattern repeated itself. Wives taken, used and discarded when they could not give him what he demanded. Some lived in humiliation, some in terror, and some died beneath the executioner's blade. The women who should have been queens were, instead, victims of a man who saw them only as vessels for his dynasty. Meanwhile, his subjects bore the weight of his choices. Taxes rose to fund wars and luxuries, and the blood of the innocent watered the soil of his kingdom. Ordinary men and women were imprisoned, tortured or executed for crimes as simple as refusing to acknowledge his supremacy over the church. The gallows and the block became symbols of his reign. England had become a land of whispers, where every tongue trembled to speak freely, and every heart beat in fear of betrayal. Paranoia consumed the king more deeply with every year. Friends became enemies, allies became rivals, and loyalty meant nothing if it was not absolute. The Tower of London filled with the condemned, nobles, clergy, commoners, anyone who stood in his path. The streets of London echoed with the cries of the dying, and yet Henry's thirst for control was never quenched. In his court, beauty and splendor masked the terror beneath. Banquets glittered with gold, music filled the halls. But behind the smiles, every man and woman knew they stood on the edge of a blade. The king's wrath was swift, and no one was safe from it. The Golden Prince who once embodied hope had transformed fully into a tyrant. The shadow of his power stretched further than ever before, but so did the trail of blood that followed in his footsteps. England was breaking beneath his rule, yet Henry himself believed he was fulfilling destiny. He thought himself chosen, guided by divine will, even as he dragged his kingdom deeper into fear and division. The seeds of his final downfall had been sown. The crown glittered brighter than ever, but the man who wore it was rotting within, consumed by the very power he had fought so desperately to control. The years of power and triumph had passed, leaving behind a man who was no longer the Golden Prince of his youth, but a broken figure, consumed by his own body and the darkness of his rule. Henry VIII grew grotesquely obese, his once athletic frame buried beneath layers of flesh that made it difficult for him to walk or even stand without pain. His legs were eaten alive by ulcers that refused to heal, the foul stench of infection following him wherever he went. He was carried through his own palaces like a bloated shadow of the man he had once been, a king who could no longer escape the rot that clung to his body. But the decay of his flesh was matched only by the decay of his mind. Paranoia clouded every thought, twisting even loyalty into suspicion. The court had become a place of trembling fear, where even his closest advisors wondered if their lives would end at the stroke of a pen or the swing of an axe. Henry no longer trusted anyone. He had executed friends, betrayed allies, and destroyed families, all to preserve the illusion of control. Every betrayal he committed only deepened his isolation, until even in a room full of courtiers, he was utterly alone. His temper, once fierce, had now become monstrous. Servants lived in terror of his rages. Courtiers masked their fear with forced smiles, and even his wives, those who remained, learned that one misstep could lead to death. His cruelty grew sharper as his strength faded, as though he believed that by breaking others, he might conceal the fact that he himself was breaking. The kingdom he ruled bore the scars of his tyranny. The economy bled under heavy taxation. Religious divisions spread like wildfire, and the executions never stopped. Every corner of England whispered of his decline, of God's curse upon him, of a ruler whose sins had finally begun to consume him. In villages and taverns, people spoke cautiously, fearful of informers, yet daring to imagine a future without him. The king who once inspired awe now inspired dread, and still Henry clung to his throne, unwilling to yield even as his body betrayed him. He ordered portraits painted to show him as a giant, broad and powerful, a godlike figure who ruled unchallenged. But the reality was different. A man rotting from within, trapped in his chamber, surrounded not by admiration, but by the whispers of death. It was in these final years that his nightmares grew worse. His paranoia made him lash out at anyone who might threaten his power. Nobles, clergy, and even his own blood found themselves at risk of his wrath. The executions piled higher, and with every drop of blood spilled, the sense grew stronger that the king was being hunted by his own sins. The courtiers who walked his halls sensed it clearly. This was no longer the reign of majesty, but the slow, dreadful collapse of a man cursed by his own choices. Each passing day carried him closer to the abyss, and though he still wore the crown, it seemed more like a shackle than a symbol of glory. The king who had defied God, broken his country, and ruled through terror was now trapped in the shadow of his own end. His body was failing, his mind was poisoned, and his soul was haunted. The final act of his life had begun, and it promised to be as horrifying as the rain that had led him there. The shadow of death stretched longer with each passing day, and though Henry VIII clung to his throne, the kingdom itself seemed to tremble beneath his decaying weight. His reign had become a grotesque theater of fear, where every whisper carried the threat of death, and every silence felt like betrayal. In his final years, England was less a kingdom and more a prison, ruled by the paranoia of a man who trusted no one, not even himself. His body was a battlefield of disease. The ulcers on his legs festered until the stench filled his chambers, seeping into the corridors of Whitehall Palace. Physicians tried every remedy, but nothing could heal the corruption that consumed him. They lanced his wounds, packed them with herbs, and drained his blood, but each attempt only deepened his agony. At night his groans echoed through the palace, and servants wept silently as they listened, too afraid to let their pity be seen. Yet even as his body rotted, his cruelty sharpened. He lashed out with renewed ferocity, determined to show that he still held power. Trials were staged, accusations invented, and executions ordered. Nobles who had once feasted at his table now knelt at the block, their heads falling into the sawdust. Entire families were destroyed, as though Henry sought to drown out his own, decay with the blood of others. The terror spread beyond the court, reaching into villages and towns where the gallows never stood empty. Religious divisions carved England apart, pitting neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. The Protestant reforms Henry had unleashed years before now festered into chaos and the people wondered if their king had traded their souls for his own ambition. At night, the king was not left in peace. His dreams grew darker, his screams louder. Witnesses claimed they heard him call out to the dead, names of wives long executed, friends long betrayed, and enemies long forgotten. He shouted as though he saw them standing in his chamber, their eyes fixed on him, their voices whispering of judgment. Servants swore they felt cold air sweep through the room, though the fires burned hot. The once mighty ruler of England had become a prisoner of his own palace. He demanded music to drown the silence, but even the songs seemed hollow. He demanded loyalty, but even the most devoted feared his gaze. He demanded life, but only death followed him. Every passing hour carried him closer to the inevitable, and yet he fought against it with all the fury that remained in him. His reign had begun in glory, but now it burned out in terror, a storm that refused to die even as its master withered away. The throne had become a gilded coffin. Every day Henry VIII clung to life, but each moment only deepened the nightmare around him. He was king in name, but his body had made him a prisoner. He could barely stand without help, his legs swollen and leaking infection, his breathing ragged and heavy. The once great Lion of England had been reduced to a beast in chains, chained not by others, but by his own failing flesh. Yet power remained, his obsession. He could not release it. He ordered constant reports, demanded to see letters, and interrogated ministers who trembled before him. Even as his words slurred with fever, he forced those around him to act as if his command still carried divine weight. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the truth. The king was fading, and England's future hung in doubt. Fear made his cruelty sharper than ever. He turned against his own blood, suspecting plots where none existed. The slightest rumor of disloyalty meant chains in the tower. Once his wrath had been terrifying in its strength, now it was terrifying in its desperation. He was drowning, dragging down all who stood near him, as though the destruction of others might delay his own end. His court was poisoned by silence. Nobles bowed lower, spoke softer, and hid their thoughts behind masks of loyalty. Ministers carried secrets like daggers, each waiting for the moment the crown would finally slip from his head. They fed his paranoia when it suited them, twisting his suspicions to their advantage, using his weakness as a weapon. The kingdom itself became a game of shadows, with Henry at the center, too blind to see that the world was already moving beyond him. At night, his chamber was a theater of horror. He screamed in his sleep, clawed at the air, and begged unseen figures for mercy. Some swore they heard him mutter about fires that could not be quenched, about chains dragging him down, about voices of the condemned echoing through the dark. The palace smelled of rot and fear, as though hell itself had stretched a hand into the king's bedchamber. Even the priests could not calm him. Their prayers fell like stones into a bottomless pit. He demanded absolution, demanded God's forgiveness, but the silence that followed was unbearable. He feared death not only because it meant the end of his power, but because he knew what waited for him beyond the grave. Every execution, every betrayal, every broken oath rose up like a shadow on the wall, reminding him that kings are not spared judgment. The courtiers who waited outside his chambers prayed not for his recovery but for his release. They wished for the end, not out of compassion but out of desperation. England was suffocating under the weight of a dying tyrant, and every day he lingered, the kingdom suffered with him. Henry, once the towering figure who defied the Pope and reshaped a nation, was now nothing but a man, bloated, broken, and terrified. And yet he refused to let go. He would not surrender the crown even as death tightened its grip. His reign, like his body, had become a grotesque parody of what it once was, a spectacle of decay that could not be hidden. The rising storm had reached its height. All that remained was the breaking. The final days of Henry VIII were not those of a king, but of a man hunted by the shadows of his own sins. He lay in his vast chamber at Whitehall, the silken canopy above his bed, unable to hide the rot that consumed his body. His swollen frame, riddled with ulcers that poured blood and pus, seemed less human than monstrous, a grotesque symbol of a reign that had devoured everything it touched. Courtiers moved through the palace like ghosts, their faces pale with fear, for even now Henry's wrath could claim them. But inside the chamber, another battle was unfolding. His fever carried him into visions that no medicine could dispel. At times he cried out to long-dead wives, their severed heads rising from the darkness to condemn him. At other times, he gasped, as though chains coiled around his limbs, dragging him toward an unseen abyss. The fire of judgment had already begun to lick at his soul, and though he was King of England, he was powerless against it. As the days blurred into nights, the horror deepened. Priests crowded his bedside, chanting prayers that dissolved into the heavy air. They spoke of salvation, but Henry's eyes, wide and frantic, betrayed that he could not find it. He begged for forgiveness, yet the silence that followed was unbearable, louder than the hymns, heavier than the incense. Servants whispered of unearthly screams echoing through the chamber, of shadows flickering across the walls though no candle burned, of a stench that was not merely decay, but damnation itself. Some swore they saw his bed shake, as if unseen hands pressed upon it, dragging him deeper into torment. And still Henry clung to life, gripping the sheets with bloodied hands, refusing to surrender, as though his crown could shield him from the darkness waiting at the edge of his breath. But the more he resisted, the more the visions consumed him, until even his waking hours became nightmares, and the mighty Lion of England lay whimpering like prey before the jaws of eternity. Then, in the silence before dawn, the terror reached its end. His breath came ragged, his eyes glazed, yet still he muttered names, wives, children, traitors, friends, all swallowed by the grave he had sent them to. His chest heaved as though he fought against unseen chains, but the struggle was hopeless. Courtiers stood frozen, priests muttered frantically, yet none could help him. Henry, who had defied the Pope, destroyed his enemies, and reshaped a nation, was at last reduced to a broken shell, trembling before a judgment he could not escape. His final cry split the chamber, a sound not of a king but of a condemned soul, and then silence swallowed him. In that silence the air seemed colder, the chamber darker, as though the weight of his sins lingered even after his body stilled. England's tyrant was dead, but the echoes of his cruelty would haunt the kingdom for generations, a legacy written not in glory, but in blood, fear, and the terror of a man who could not escape himself. When Henry VIII finally breathed his last, silence fell across Whitehall Palace like a shroud. The courtiers who had lived in terror for so long did not weep. They stood in hushed disbelief, as though afraid that the tyrant might rise again. For decades, England had bent beneath his will, and now the kingdom faced a strange emptiness, a void carved not only by death, but by the weight of his sins. Yet the smell of decay lingered long after his body cooled, a stench that seemed less of the flesh and more of the legacy he left behind. The kingdom he built was fractured, divided by faith and scarred by blood. His break from Rome had reshaped England forever, but the cost was written in the destruction of monasteries, the plundering of holy places, and the execution of men and women whose only crime was faith. His hunger for heirs had left the nation in chaos, daughters and fragile alliances struggling to bear the burden of succession. The people whispered in taverns and markets, wondering if God had punished the land through its king, if the storms, the famines and the endless fear were not just fate, but judgment. Even in death, Henry's shadow reached into every corner of the realm, but it was not only England that carried the scars. His wives, his friends, his enemies, all were part of a trail of broken lives that stretched across Europe. Catherine. Of Aragon discarded, Anne Boleyn beheaded, Jane Seymour dead in childbirth, Anne of Cleves humiliated, Catherine Howard executed, Catherine Parr left to outlive him, but not his shadow. Ministers who once guided him died by his order. Thousands of nameless souls perished on his word. These ghosts did not vanish with his death. They lived on in the memories of those who had watched their loved ones dragged to the scaffold, in the silent terror passed down through generations. And yet history is never simple. To some, Henry remained the king who had given England independence from Rome, who had strengthened the crown, who had stood as a titan among monarchs. His portrait still showed him not as the rotting corpse of his final days, but as the broad-shouldered giant, hand on sword, gaze defiant. To his admirers, he was a king of destiny. To his victims, he was a monster. The truth was more complex. He was both. A man of greatness and a man of horror. A ruler whose reign was written in triumph and in terror alike. But beneath the gilded myths and painted lies, one question lingered like a wound. In those last hours, when he saw visions of wives and victims rising from the darkness, when he cried out for forgiveness that never came, was it disease that killed Henry VIII? Or was it the weight of his own sins crushing him at last? And if even a king could not escape judgment, what hope remains for the rest of us?